Imagine a quiet morning on an open ocean, somewhere between 2 points that the map would show as tiny specks. The water is not perfectly flat, but it is disciplined, shaped by long, regular swells pushing under the canoe like slow breathing. The wind is steady, neither strong nor weak. You are not rushing. You are observing. A team works with you, but there is little to do at this hour except steer, adjust, and watch. In Polynesian voyaging traditions, the sky is not just weather. It is a ledger of information, patiently updated, page by page. Clouds are an index. In that ledger, they mark where islands sit beyond the horizon, where warm reefs breathe moisture into the air, where mountains press wind into rising, where lagoons tint the underside of cloud with a color you can learn to recognize. A navigator learns to read those marks with a patience that is not hurried by drama, because the ocean has its own clock. That clock moves in the rhythm of dawn breezes, mid-morning cumulus, afternoon showers, and evening clearing. It repeats. Enough to be useful, and that is the quiet gift of routine. You might think of cloud reading as a handful of ideas, repeated and refined across thousands of miles and many generations. Each idea is simple enough. Together they form a practice. First, there is the concept of the land cloud. Over a high island, a mountain takes air that is moving and forces it to rise, cool, and condense. Even if the mountain is hidden by the curve of the sea, the cloud above it can sit in place, renewed by the air that rises from the island and its forested slopes. To the navigator, a fixed cloud that lingers in one sector of the horizon growing and fading but not drifting away suggests land beneath it. It may show a faint pile or anvil in the warm part of the day. Over a smaller atoll, without high peaks, there may still be a low bank of cloud, not as dramatic, but persistent. A navigator learns how much persistence is significant and how much is just passing weather. It is not a quick judgment. It is an observation that matures over hours, sometimes over a day. Second, there is the color beneath the cloud. The ocean. Surface reflects the sky, but lagoons and shallow reefs can reflect differently, especially in broad daylight. There are accounts old and modern of navigators, noting a greenish or pale underside to a cloud sitting over an atoll with a broad lagoon. The tint is not bright. It is subdued. It appears when the sun angle is right and the air is clear enough. Over deep ocean, cloud bases tend to be a uniform gray, sometimes warm, sometimes cool. Over a large lagoon, the base can take on a slight green cast. A navigator does not look for a bright signal. They look for consistency. Is the tint there? Across hours? Does it align with swell clues in bird patterns? One clue alone is rarely enough. Third, there is shape and timing. In the trade wind belts, morning often begins with smaller cumulus clouds low, puffy, with flat bases and then a gradual growth into taller forms by midday. Over land, that growth is more pronounced. At dawn, a navigator notes the sky like a ledger entry. Cumulus scattered, bases at a certain height, the eastern horizon clearing, a faint band of higher clouds to the north. By mid-morning, they check again. Does a particular clump over the western sector swell more than others and hold its ground? By noon, if the clump is still there, slightly higher, with a textured top that suggests steady rising air, they mark that in their memory. If in the afternoon the surrounding sky changes, but the clump remains roughly in place, they give it more weight. This sequence feels slow because it is slow. It is an accumulation of small confirmations. Fourth, there is movement or lack of it. Everything in the sky moves, but not all movement means drift. If the wind is from the east at a steady speed, the cloud field as a whole slides west. But a land cloud fed by rising air will regenerate as the broad field passes, staying centered over its island source. To see this, You do not merely look up, you fix your gaze on a cloud and watch it against the horizon and against landmarks in your mind, such as the angle of the sun or a particular swell line. When you are low to the sea, the horizon is close, and fixed reference points are scarce. So the navigator uses memory and the feel of the swell to maintain a steady line of sight. It is tedious. That tedium is the task.fifth. There is the way clouds arrange themselves in lines, known today as cloud streets, that often run along the wind direction. In steady trade winds, these parallel bands point you to the wind's path, helpful when a navigator wishes to confirm that the breeze has not shifted subtly. If the cloud streets curve near a sector of horizon, bending around a pale dome of rising air, that bend can suggest an island's influence far beyond, where the eye can see the land. All of this happens together with other observations that are just as quiet. The boat is kept in trim. A helmsman feels the swell's dominant direction under the hull, then notes a secondary swell crossing it. The navigator knows that a chain of islands to the south has a reef system that throws a distinct, long-period swell from a particular angle. If that swell returns under the canoe in regular intervals, and a suspicious cloud seems to sit in the same quadrant, the two hints inform each other. No single sign settles the matter. The practice is to layer signs until a calm confidence, not certainty, emerges. The long history behind this practice is not a story of one person or one voyage. It is an accumulation across the eastern and central Pacific. The movement of people who settled archipelagos spread farther than continental distances. The Society Islands, the Tuamotus, the Marquesas, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Aotearoa. The boats were not solitary experiments. They were built by communities with roles distributed through many hands. Woodworkers selecting timbers, fiber workers braiding sennit, fishermen preparing spare lines and hooks, elders reviewing seasonal wind patterns, and navigators training apprentices in ways that look modest from the outside. Among those modest methods, getting up before dawn to watch the color of the eastern sky, or sitting with a younger sailor at noon and inviting them to draw the outline of a cloud as it changes every 5 minutes. Drawing a cloud sounds unimportant, but it trains attention. It logs detail. On many islands, this knowledge how to read clouds, swells, and stars was kept in families and schools that combined memory with performance. In the Caroline Islands to the northwest of Polynesia, navigators developed sophisticated systems for organizing directions and reference points in the head. In Polynesia proper, much was similar in spirit, though institutions and names varied from place to place. Regardless of the specific lineage, their pedagogy shared a plain rhythm: watch, compare, recall, and test. A student learned when not to trust a cloud, on days when the whole sky thickened with tropical moisture and showers. Moved through in sheets, the logic of the island cloud broke down. They learned to discount illusions at dusk, when bases darken quickly and make distant cells look more dramatic than they are. They learned to weight morning clouds lightly and attribute more value to patterns that persisted through thermal cycles, or uses of clouds other than finding islands. On long passages, a navigator still needed to decide whether to carry more sail or less, whether to maintain the current tack or to adjust, whether to prepare for squalls in the next hour. Low dark streaks with visibly trailing rain virga warned of cooling downdrafts that might shift wind angles. Thin high veils of cirrus to the west could signal a subtle change the next day. Even the unremarkable diamond of blue between four cumulus towers mattered. It signaled the scale of convection cells, which would determine the texture of the afternoon. All of this carried over into small life aboard. When to cook on an open hearthstone set on deck, when to secure mats and baskets, when to bring out or stow the sun cover, and when to dry fishing lines. The ordinary routines showed respect for the sky's schedule. Because the canoe is low to the sea, Scale is different from what you might see on shore. A cumulus cloud 5 miles away looks large. A tower 20 miles out can dominate a horizon. The navigator learns not to be impressed by size alone. They develop something closer to a patient comparison. Does that cloud change faster or slower? And its neighbor? Is its base higher or lower? Does it throw a faint shadow on the sea that appears darker than usual? They will sometimes look for a line of birds under the cloud, not to watch the birds themselves, but because terns and noddies often commute between roosts on land and feeding grounds. If a steady stream of birds arrives from one sector in the morning and returns that way in late afternoon, and the same sector holds a cloud that does not wander, the evidence accumulates. You can picture a navigator's mind building a quiet map that has no ink, just weight given to the same direction each hour. Historical voices in the 20th century recorded details of this work during a time when it was fading in some regions and enduring in others. Researchers traveled with navigators in Micronesia and Polynesia, documenting the way cloud piles and other signs informed landfall decisions. Modern revivals of voyaging in Hawaii and elsewhere brought these observations back into active practice, not as quaint curiosities, but as functional tools. Crew members on modern double-hulled canoes learned to set a subvocal clock. Every half hour, check the 4 quadrants, inventory clouds that remain in place, and tie those to swell lines and star bearings carried over from night steering. This might sound complicated, yet on board it feels methodical, slow, and repetitive. The repetition is part of why it works. Clouds help, but they mislead too. There are days when warm water currents feed cumulus more strongly in one band of sea, creating something like a false land cloud. There are afternoons when a line of small showers will stall for hours because of a localized inversion, looking like a row of islands. There are mornings when a long, low cloud bank at the meeting of breeze and calm gives the impression of a large landmass just beyond sight. The experienced navigator treats the sky with caution. If a cloud suggests land, they seek confirmation. A different swell angle that appears every few minutes might hint at a reef system out of sight. If that swell and the cloud align, confidence improves. If seabirds appear in number, flying low and direct, weight increases further. If the smell changes, some navigators speak of a faint earthy or floral odor on the wind near high islands then. And only then has the cloud become more than a hint. You can imagine a day aboard when the navigator explains this to a younger crew member, not with lectures, but with simple prompts. What do you see to the south? How does it compare to the west? What do you think that means? The student answers, then watches through the morning. At noon, the teacher asks again. What stayed the same? What changed? On a voyage, there is time. For this, the ocean gives hours between adjustments. This is how ordinary instruction becomes a tested habit. Cloud reading also connects to seasonal expectations. In some archipelagos, particular months bring more uniform trade wind cumulus. Others bring disturbances that sweep away local patterns. A navigator sets off knowing, for example, that in a certain season high islands are more likely to wear a cap of clouds for most of the day, while atolls present subtler signs. They plan not around perfect predictions, but around the narrow windows when signs are reliable. Even the time of landfall is considered. If you approach an atoll at night, cloud clues are limited, so you rely more on swell and stars, and delay your approach if safety requires daylight. There is a practical modesty, here an acceptance that clouds are helpful, but not sovereign. From a modern perspective, these practices can be folded into meteorology, orographic lifting over islands, cloud streets in the trades, moisture recycling over lagoons, the daily cycle of convection. But the navigators did not need scientific language for the use to be sound. They needed attention, memory, and agreement among the crew. Agreement is not trivial. On a canoe, if the navigator concludes that a cloud fixes land in a certain quadrant, the helmsman adjusts course. That decision brings costs. Distance lost if wrong, supplies consumed over extra days, fatigue. So the navigator learns to speak quietly, but with grounded reasons. They point to 3 or 4 signs, not one. They note how long they have watched, not just what they see now. This style of decision-making, based on cloud reading among other signs, reflects something steady and practical. There are places where this practice is especially memorable. In the Tuamotu archipelago low atolls, spread across a wide area clouds. Over lagoons have long alerted sailors moving between passes. In the Society Islands, towering peaks can make cloud hats visible beyond sight of land. In Micronesia to the west, navigators of the Marshall Islands and the Caroline Islands developed an elaborate cloud and swell literacy. That fits their geography of small atolls scattered over large distances. While names and exact methods differ, by region and language, the patient craft of watching the sky is a shared thread. If you sit with this a while, the pace slows further. You start to see how a day divides itself into modest tasks. Early morning, confirm the wind's angle, note the cloud bases, look for the first distant birds. Mid-morning, adjust sail if showers approach, check if any clouds hold a position. Noon, eat a simple meal, review direction by the sun, recheck the suspicious cloud. Afternoon, watch for warm rising air over land if it exists. Prepare for small squalls. Evening, note the clearing. Prepare to hand steering over to the stars. This is not romantic in the sense of high excitement. It is, in its very ordinariness, a careful way of moving over water while learning the mood of the sky. Clouds are temporary, yet they mark places where the sea and land meet in ways you cannot see otherwise. A habit of reading them became part of how Polynesian and related navigators extended their range and safely returned home. It also shaped the attention of communities training people to wait, compare, and accept partial information as enough. To act. In a world where a line of white puffs can be either nothing or a sign of a reef just beyond vision, patience is not simply a virtue. It is a tool. When you think of the first time a crew saw a faint, stationary dome of cloud after days of open sea, it is tempting to imagine a sudden thrill. But more likely, the feeling was controlled. Make a note. Hold course for now. Confirm with birds at dusk. Listen to the swell after midnight. By morning, if the cloud was still there, if the smell shifted, if the birds returned along that path, then the canoe might edge closer, daylight rising on the low line of palms or the dark shoulder of a mountain. In this steady way, clouds became maps imperfect, changing, but useful when read with other signs and a disciplined routine. If you were to sit quietly on the crossbeam of a voyaging canoe and decide to make clouds your main task for the day, the work would be uncomplicated and steady. You would begin by clearing your mind of fast expectations. Navigation by clouds is not a quick signal. It is more like keeping notes for a long conversation. The morning begins with a basic inventory. You look to each quarter of the horizon and name what is there in plain terms. Low scattered cumulus, a thin veil of high cloud, a soft bank to the south, clear space to the east. You note the height of the cloud bases by a simple trick. Hold. Your hand at arm's length can count the finger widths between the horizon and the bottom of the clouds. It is not precise, but over time you learn that 3 finger widths of base height on a day like this is ordinary, and 6 suggests a drier air mass. The numbers have meaning only in context. As the canoe keeps to its course, you keep to yours. Watch, compare, and carry forward what you saw an hour ago. High islands make themselves known mostly by what they do to air. The effect is reliable enough to become a habit. Rising terrain takes moist trade wind air and lifts it, cooling it gently until water vapor condenses into cloud. Over a volcanic island with peaks Tahiti, Moorea, Raya Tir in the Society Islands, Nuku Hiva, and Hiva Oe in the Marquesas. The island of Hawaii, the same pattern appears on many days. A cap of cloud builds late morning, thickens around midday, and often thins toward dusk. From beyond the visible horizon, this cap can show as a fixed heap, sometimes with a smooth veil atop it. If the trade wind slides evenly past the island, a trailing banner of cloud may stretch downwind, thin but persistent, indicating a mountain's small but steady disruption of airflow. You learn the look of that banner. It does not rush. It replenishes itself in place. Atolls behave more quietly. Without peaks, they do not force the air to climb as dramatically. Yet a broad lagoon, warm and shallow, gives up moisture, and a collar of low cloud can gather through the day, its base a little darker and flatter than the surrounding sky. Sailors across the low archipelagos, the Tuamotus, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, have long spoken of this faint signature. It is not the dense hat you see over a mountain island, but a subdued halo. In good light, the underside of a cloud over a large lagoon can show a pale greenish cast, more evident if you keep returning to check it as the sun moves. A tint is no guarantee of land, but it is a nudge. The method is to see if the nudge returns, and if it agrees with other signs. Time of day matters. Early morning clouds can be misleading because the day's heating has not built much contrast. Late morning to mid-afternoon is often most revealing, when rising air over land is strongest. Navigators use this daily cycle the way one might use a tide table, not as a rule, but as a rhythm. If, by late morning, a clump in the western sector grows more than its neighbors and holds its ground through the noon hour, attention settles on that quadrant. If by mid-afternoon the same clump remains, even as the broader field drifts, it becomes a meaningful entry in the day's ledger. The ledger is not written. It lives in memory as a tally of small facts checked against other tallies. On traditional voyages, apprentices learn to keep this tally by speaking it aloud at intervals. Every hour, a student might report to the navigator, clouds low and even to the north, a fixed pile in the west since morning, high wisps arriving from the south. The navigator would not correct quickly. They would wait and ask again later. Is the pile still there? Did the wisps increase? The point was not to turn the sky into an exam. It was to teach the pace at which conclusions are safe to make. Other signs reinforce or weaken the case for land. Birds are one. Terns, noddies, and frigate birds follow daily routines that sailors learn to read by repetition. If, in the morning, birds stream out toward a feeding ground and return in late afternoon, the returning stream often points toward the roost. If that line of flight aligns with the quadrant of a stubborn cloud, the weight of evidence grows. Scent is another quiet cue. Approaching a high island from windward, people have reported a faint change in smell soil. Vegetation, sometimes a floral note carried on the breeze. The smell alone proves little, but late in a day of consistent cloud and bird signs, it can confirm what your eyes have suspected. A case might help visualize the pace. Imagine a canoe sailing westward from the Tuamotus toward the Society Islands, a route that ancient crews traveled. The Tuamotus are low and spread widely. The Societies rise high from the sea. On the first day after leaving the last atoll, the sky is ordinary. Trade wind cumulus scattered, bases fairly even, small showers to the south. Nothing holds in place. The navigator keeps the course by swell, and by the noon sun, then by the evening stars. On the second day, late morning brings a modest heap of cloud in the western sector that does not drift away. The navigator marks it, but makes no change. Birds arrive and depart from several directions. Not helpful yet. By mid-afternoon, the same heap is a little taller, with a soft top. A subtle bend appears in a line of small cumulus, what modern meteorology calls a cloud streak curving around the area of the heap. The navigator speaks quietly to the helmsman. Hold this course. Watch the western sky through evening. At dusk, the cloud dissolves as the air cools. The stars take over. In the early hours, a secondary swell longer, and from a slightly different angle, begins to work under the hull, suggesting a distant chain of reefs. By late morning on the third day, the same sector shows a new cap of cloud. This time, a soft haze seems to hang below it. Birds returning at afternoon come long and low from that direction. The smell carries a note that is not simply sea. Now, the navigator is more certain. Approach is still cautious. Land and reefs demand respect. But the cloud has played its part. Not a dramatic revelation, just a steady sign that, combined with others, made the decision safer. Sailors from far beyond Polynesia noticed similar effects. European mariners in the age of sail, approaching. High volcanic islands in the tropical Pacific sometimes wrote of a cloud fixing over the land, seen before the island itself could be made out. The description matches what local navigators already used, though outsiders recorded it as a curiosity. The practical value remained the same. When the sea and sky offer few steady marks, any pattern that repeats in place is valuable. Clouds also arrange themselves into shapes that can confuse the unwary. The intertropical convergence, zone wear. Trade winds from north and south meet breeds long bands of towering convective clouds and rain. In Oceania, a diagonal belt of disturbed weather known in modern terms as the South Pacific Convergence. Zone wanders across seasons. When a voyager meets such a belt, islands vanish behind curtains of showers, and cloud piles lose their local ties. A navigator plans for seasons when these belts lie away from their route, or treats any stationary cloud with suspicion if the day's atmosphere is thick and unsettled. Even within the trades, lines of showers can stall for hours along subtle boundaries of temperature and moisture, mimicking the persistence of a land cloud. The safeguard is cross-checking. If swell and bird routes do not agree, the sky's display is set aside, or given little weight until it behaves more usefully. The slow instruction behind all this is not limited to the sea. On many islands, fishermen and farmers share the habit of looking up and comparing. In valleys, people know that a cap of cloud forming early on the ridges can mean afternoon showers and a cool evening. Along shore, a morning band of cloud on the horizon can be the edge of a calm zone, useful for small canoe trips to outer reefs. The same patient reading of cloud becomes part of coastal life. Drying nets before showers, tending taro or breadfruit, with an eye on a growing cloud that will bring a light rain, delaying a visit to a neighboring islet because a line of squalls is marching along the lagoon's rim. These are not dramatic decisions. They are the quiet coordination of work with the sky's schedule. On board a long voyage, the practical routines linked to clouds create a pattern for the day. If a dark streak on the horizon shows trailing rain virga, you prepare to shorten. Sail an hour before it reaches you, allowing for downdrafts and a temporary shift. If the sky opens in a diamond-shaped blue between four puffs, you plan to cook a midday meal then, to avoid embers scattering in a gust from a nearby shower. If high, thin veils of cirrus arrive from one direction, you make a small note that tomorrow's wind might change. The notes are not acted upon immediately. They are stored. Over days, those stored notes keep the crew's work predictable and safer. Food is not cooked in a scramble, gear is not stowed in panic, and no one is surprised by the ordinary. Where language for clouds is rich, it tends to be rooted in observation rather than theory. Across Polynesian languages, Words for cloud, sky, and light often overlap because the same daily cycle governs them. The specific terms differ by island group and family, and the meanings are tied to local experience. A navigator's instruction might not enumerate many names. It might simply point, "That shape forms overland after noon." Some schools did develop detailed vocabularies, but precision came mostly from the habit of returning to look again. In Micronesia, where navigators created structured systems for organizing direction and memory, cloud observation fit easily within their broader method. A grid of orientation held in the mind, filled with daily entries, each one small. The island. World is large, and cloud practice varies with it. In the Marquesas, where steep valleys carve deep into ridges, early afternoon clouds can gather in patterned places, each valley with its own plume. In Hawaii, high peaks often tier and reshape trade clouds into forms that can be seen at great distance when light is favorable. In the Tuamotus, the signature is more modest, yet many canoe crews can tell stories of steering by a faintly tinged cloud base over a broad lagoon on a sunny day. In the Cook Islands and the Australs, winter fronts occasionally sweep through, bringing high layered clouds that make local signs less reliable, reminding navigators to lean more on swell and birds during those times. The diversity does not change the core craft. It only changes which entries in the ledger carry the most weight. Some readers might ask how far away a cloud can help. The answer is not exact. Over a high island, a cap can be noticed 100 kilometers or more away in clear air by a practiced eye, though the certainty grows as you close. Over low atolls, the helpful range is smaller. The slight greenish cast under a cloud over a lagoon, when it appears at all, requires daylight, a clean atmosphere, and an angle that brings the lagoon's reflection to the cloud base. Even then, a navigator prefers multiple signs. The method is conservative. It protects the crew from the confidence of a single clue dot in the 20th century. Scholars and sailors who traveled with Pacific navigators accorded this conservatism as one of the craft's strengths. They noted how navigators would explicitly rate each sign as strong or weak, and defer any change in course until at least 2 or 3 strong signs aligned. Clouds were often the earliest hint, but rarely the deciding proof. The style of leadership matched the method. Calm statements, reasons given, time allowed for others to watch and agree. Decisions were framed as shared work rather than assertion. On a canoe, this approach keeps people attentive without anxiety. It turns the sky into a companion rather than a demand, because voyages were community enterprises, small technical habits. Like cloud reading flowed back into daily talk ashore. People would mention that a neighbor's breadfruit trees liked a year of frequent afternoon caps on the mountain, or that the lagoon's surface ran silty under a ceiling of low cloud on the day of a certain fish run. These comments seem small and domestic, but they are how practical meteorology becomes cultural memory. A child who grows up hearing such remarks, then later sails. There are also careful warnings passed down. Do not chase a cloud at dusk. Wait for morning. Beware the long, low bank that hangs on the horizon at the boundary of a calm. It moves with you and tempts you off course. Trust a cloud only if the swell agrees. In regions where superior mirages sometimes form, over warm sea and cool air less common in the tropics, but possible, the rule is the same. Do not let visual oddities bend your course unless other signs confirm them. In this way, the sky becomes a tested partner rather than a beautiful distraction dot, as navigation without instruments revived in various parts of the Pacific in recent decades. Crews relearned the discipline of the cloud ledger. On training sails, students were assigned simple duties: call out persistent piles, track the bending of cloud streets, compare the color under cloud bases around midday, log bird directions. They found, as their ancestors did, that clouds feel more helpful when you resist the urge to decide quickly. The effect is almost domestic. The boat runs on routines, reefing, cooking, steering, bailing, and the sky's routines fit beside them. By night, stars take the lead. By day, clouds and swells resume. The alternation gives the voyage a heartbeat that is reassuring. If you step back from the sea and look at this practice in the broad frame of human skills, it fits a pattern seen in other crafts, using slow, repeating signals to make steady choices. Farmers watch the color of dawn on mountain faces to time irrigation. Herdsmen test the wind by the way dust holds over a distant ridge. Urban builders use to judge weather for mortar, setting by the feel of humidity on stone. In the Pacific, navigators made an ocean-crossing art from patient cloud reading, but the art's foundation is ordinary attention. The strength lies not in naming every form, but in building a habit of watching something that changes slowly and learning when. It is safe to act on what you see. In the end, clouds are useful precisely because they are imperfect. If they gave clear answers, they would teach little. Instead, they ask for the same things the sea does: time, humility, and a willingness to accept partial knowledge. A canoe moves across great distances by adding small certainties together: swell lines, bird paths, sky smells, and, during the yaw, day, the quiet presence of a cloud that does not wander. By now, the shape of this practice is familiar. A navigator looks up, waits, compares, and lets small signals take on meaning only when they repeat. Clouds offer hints of islands' caps over high peaks, faint collars over warm lagoons, the gentle bend of cloud streets around a rising dome of air. They also offer warnings of passing showers, shifts in wind, and the tempo of a day's work. On board, none of these signs shout. They accumulate lightly until there is enough to act upon. When we set these habits alongside the broader story of Pacific voyaging, they look modest, but the modesty is part of their strength. Sailing among archipelagos that are small on the map and far apart, navigators learn to treat the day sky as a working surface. At night, they steered by stars and swell. By day, they continued their orientation with clouds, birds, and the hoys, and the feel of the sea under the hull. The result was a continuous method, stitched across 24 hours, that reduced the risk of surprise and made long passages steady rather than dramatic. Cloud reading supported several practical outcomes that mattered to communities: earlier awareness of landfall. A persistent cap over a high island, noticed hours or a day before land became visible, allowed navigators to adjust course gradually and arrive in daylight. For atolls, the clues were subtler low banks of cloud, a slight change in cloud base. Color at midday, yet even a small early hint helped a crew keep attention on a safe approach to reef passes. Smoother management of the canoe, recognizing lines of rain or the edges of small squalls in time to reef or ease the sail, meant less stress on the rigging and fewer abrupt maneuvers. On a vessel held together by careful lashings and laborious maintenance, avoiding sharp loads was an everyday priority. Predictable routines, knowing when the afternoon would likely bring brief showers, shaped the schedule. Cooking earlier, drying gear in the right window, setting a watch rotation that respected the sky's rhythm. The canoe moved not only across water, but also within a timetable that the sky suggested shared decision-making. Because clouds can mislead, crews learn to confer. A navigator's quiet explanation linking a stationary cloud, a secondary. Swell, a line of returning birds offered reasons that others could check. This made leadership practical and calm, grounded in evidence that any watchful person could see. If you look for this approach in the traces of historical writing, it appears steadily, but without flourish. Island elders spoke to visiting scholars about cloud hats and fixed heaps. Sailors from beyond the Pacific, arriving over the same seas, occasionally noted clouds that fixed over land as they neared high islands. In the 20th century, Pacific navigators, who still practiced non-instrument methods, guided researchers at sea and explained, not dramatically, how a day's sky could be read. The details did not require special terminology to function. They required patience and continuity. Apprenticeship was the transmission method. On board, students did not memorize theory first. They were given tasks that trained attention. A student might be told to mark a cloud by a nickname and report on its behavior at the top of each hour. Or they might be asked to compare the bases of clouds in 4 quadrants and say which were lower and darker, then watch to see if those bases sank further by noon. At shore schools of navigation in Micronesia, such as lineages known in the Caroline Islands, mentor navigators kept the structure of memory alive through recitations and initiations, with ceremonies like Po marking the transition from student to navigator. In Polynesian settings, where institutions varied, the instruction often remained a family matter or a community craft, tucked into fishing, inter-island travel, and seasonal knowledge. In all cases, cloud reading belonged to the early stages of training, an everyday skill that prepared the mind to hold the more elaborate star patterns of night. Seasonal expectations set the outer frame. In months when the trades were consistent, the island signatures in the sky were clearer. In months of disturbances, a navigator discounted clouds and leaned more on swell, birds, and timing. The caution extended to specific zones, broad regions of tropical convergence could drape the sky in wandering belts of showers and thunderheads that obscured local effects. Knowing when to trust the day sky and when to treat it lightly was part of the craft. This was not a theoretical stance. It was a practical rule meant to keep crews from chasing illusions. The everyday use of cloud knowledge also fostered a patient style of leadership. Voyaging canoes were community vessels. Builders, lashers, carvers, sail makers, and families invested labor and reputation in each departure. On board, the navigator's authority rested on the ability to keep the canoe on course and to deliver the crew home again. A style that preferred layered, checkable signs helped maintain trust. When the navigator called out a cloud in the western sector and added that the secondary swell agreed and birds were returning along that path, the helmsman and crew recognized the logic, not just the command. If the signs weakened, the navigator said so, and the decision was revised. This gave the canoe resilience. It also turned the slow sky into a shared workplace. Over the decades of the modern voyaging revival, these steady habits were not only remembered, but tested anew on long routes. When the double-hulled canoe Hak Lee sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti in the 1970s under non-instrument navigation, the craft drew on teachings from Micronesian master navigator Mau Pialeg and the emerging skills of Hawaiian navigators such as Nainoa Thompson, alongside the practical seamanship of the crew. The night sky's star compass took the lead, but the day's sky filled the gaps. Crews logged persistent cloud formations, assessed rain lines ahead of squalls, and adjusted daily routines to fit the weather schedule. Later voyages across the Pacific and around the world reinforced the lesson. Even in a time of satellites, radars, and forecasts, a canoe's safety and efficiency improve when the people aboard keep a simple ledger of the sky and sea. The revival did not treat cloud reading as quaint. It treated it as usable. What stands out, looking quietly across time, is how much this art belongs to the category of ordinary care. The techniques are subtle, but they are not occult. They resemble the home crafts that make life work. Noticing when bread dough feels ready because the air is dry today. Seeing that paint will set poorly because evening fog is likely. Judging that laundry will dry before dusk because the breeze carries a certain feel. At sea, The stakes are higher, yet the attitude is similar. People who live by water and wind become attuned to small, repeated patterns. Cloud reading is one expression of that attunement. It has cultural weight beyond the practical. The way communities talk about the day sky through proverbs, teaching phrases, and shared memories contributes to a feeling of place. A ridge that often wears a cap by noon becomes a familiar character. A lagoon whose clouds tint a certain way under summer sun becomes part of local identity. Children grow up with the same sights their grandparents watched. When they later stand on a deck and see a stationary heap on the horizon, they are not seeing it for the first time. They are recognizing an old friend in a new setting. The continuity forms part of cultural resilience. Clouds also remind us that Pacific navigation was never about one sign or one invention. It was an ensemble. Star paths stored in the mind, swell patterns felt in the hull, bird routes learned by repetition, the smell and taste of air, and in daylight, the many moods of cloud and light. The ensemble is what made ocean crossings possible and returns reliable. When outsiders once argued that long voyages were accidental or unlikely, one way to answer was simply to show the ensemble in use, methodically, on the water. Over time, that demonstration proved persuasive because it was public and practical. Anyone aboard could watch the same sky and see the same signs being combined into decisions. A conclusion, then, looks plain. Cloud reading did not carry canoes across the Pacific by itself. It helped them arrive safely, more often, and with less stress. It fit into a daily schedule that respected the sky's tempo. It supported a style of leadership suited to small crews in big waters. It trained attention in a way that served people ashore as well as at sea. It moved through families, schools, and communities as part of a broader knowledge system that valued patience. There is a final usefulness in this story for people who do not sail. It suggests that paying attention to slow signals, things that change over hours rather than minutes, has enduring value. In a museum, you might see a model, canoe, or a stick chart, and feel a gap between those objects and daily life today. Yet the habit behind them is not distant. It is the habit of making a record in your mind, updating it without fuss, and acting when the weight of small evidence accumulates. This habit does not require special equipment. It requires making time. That is perhaps why it fits sleep. The day stretches, the mind settles, and small details return without demanding a rush. On the open ocean, a cloud that did not wander could mean the difference between a tense night approach and a measured arrival at noon. On a village shore, the same cloud could mean it was a good hour to mend nets under shade before a light rain. Across centuries, these are modest advantages. But life is often built from modest advantages, repeated and shared dot as the canoe in. Your mind rounds a long arc toward a group of islands. You can picture the last day of approach. Morning brings the familiar stack of cloud over a sector that has been quietly insisting itself for a day and a half. The swell carries a faint, longer pulse under the regular trades. Birds cross your path and return along the same line in late. Afternoon, the smell changes slightly. There is no fanfare. The helmsman trims, the sail breeze, and the crew keeps working at ordinary tasks cooking, checking lines, coiling rope. By evening, the cloud softens. By dawn, the island's outline shows as a darker band. The sky has done its part by being itself, and people have done theirs by paying calm attention. This is the legacy, a way of reading the world that privileges routine over noise, and that converts a passing moment a cloud's shape, a low tint, a bend in a line of puffs into a safe choice made at the right time. It travels well into any life that needs steadiness, whether on water or land. Night on the open ocean has a patient pace. The swells go on with their long, even rhythm. The deck of a canoe creaks a little at the lashing points as wood and rope settle and release. Someone is steering, light hands on a long sweep, sideline. Set just above the horizon, there is no rush. The sky turns its slow wheel, and the work is to follow it at a human speed star to star, bearing to bearing, always quietly updating dot. At the center of this night practice stands a simple idea. Horizon can be divided into a circle of directions, and the rising and setting places of known stars can be assigned to those directions. The circle is not a hard instrument. It is a memory device. Across the Pacific, navigators used variations of this device. Some traditions grouped the horizon into named houses, each a sector where certain stars rise and set. The exact names differ by island and language, but the method is steady. When a bright star climbs from the water in its house, the helmsman can hold course by keeping the prow aimed at that place. When the star ascends too high to steer by, another star takes its role. As each guide star completes its arc, the navigator changes to the next. The whole night is a sequence slow, clear, and predictable dot in Micronesia's Caroline lines. This circle of directions was embedded in a larger system for keeping track of course and position. In Hawaii and other parts of Polynesia, the revival of non-instrument voyaging in the late 20th century drew on Micronesian teaching and local knowledge to articulate a star compass in fresh terms. The method is not a mechanical compass. It is a structure for attention. It organizes the horizon so that a person can steer by the heavens without measuring tools. It fits naturally with other steady guides. The feel of the swells against the hull, the sound of wind, the faint loom of clouds at daybreak. If you picture the star compass in practice, it looks like this. The horizon is divided into repeating sectors north, northeast, east, and the smaller slices between, all the way around. Each slice has stars associated with it. In one slice, Sirius rises in the season when it is visible. In another, Canopus makes its broad arc low in the southern sky. The Southern Cross appears in its own region, and its short, distinct shape helps fix the south point when conditions are right. Far to the north, Polaris, low from tropical latitudes, steadies the north side of the circle when clouds let it show. Between these anchors are many other guides, bright stars and star clusters, whose names and habits are memorized in order when they rise, where they set, which pairs make reliable lines, and how those lines drift through the night. This is the walking speed of the title. The sky moves steadily, and the navigator walks along with it, not in a hurry, not stopping, just keeping pace with the sequence. On land, teachers sometimes make the concept literal. They draw a circle in the sand or mark points in a courtyard and ask students to walk around it in the direction the sky turns. As they go, the students point to where specific stars would rise and set. They recite the order in which those stars take over as guides through the hours. They practice turning their bodies slowly to keep facing the correct house while naming the star that belongs there. It is almost a dance, but it is also a schedule. Mo Pialag, a master navigator from the small island of Satawal in the Caroline Islands, became a quiet bridge between worlds in this practice. He grew up in a place where navigation knowledge was held carefully within families and schools. As a young person, he was trained and later initiated in the navigator's path in a ceremony that marked the acceptance of responsibilities toward community and sea. The knowledge he carried included the star paths, the daily and seasonal behavior of wind and clouds, the reading of swells, and the careful use of a mental device known by various terms in his culture that let a navigator imagine an island moving in relation to the canoe, and the stars as a way to keep track of how far along a route one had traveled. This mental framework turned the ocean into a map that could be held in the head. In the mid-1970s, when people in Hawaii organized the construction of a double-hulled canoe and planned a non-instrument voyage to Tahiti. They invited Mo to guide that first long passage. What happened at sea during that journey has been described many times. The canoe left, the crew steered by stars and swells, and landfall came as planned. What matters here is the steady, ordinary detail of the night work. With no instruments, course-keeping required continuous, modest attention. On watch, crew members learned to point out the rising of a guide star in its house, then note when it was time to shift to the next. They learned not to rush the change, to wait until the earlier star had climbed high enough that steering by it became imprecise, then adopt the next target at the horizon. The star compass gave order to that routine. It broke the night into manageable segments, each held by a familiar star. The method was not only about the stars' positions. It was about the relationships between them. A navigator knows that a star that rises north of east will set north of west, and one that rises south of east will set south of west. By keeping track of which side of the east point a star rises, the navigator knows whether a tiny, unnoticed drift has pushed the canoe off the intended line. This is not an abstract rule. It shows up in small corrections. A degree left here, a degree right there, enough to keep a heading faithful across. Hours. When clouds steal a star, the navigator shifts focus to another in the same region or temporarily relies on the swell. The habit is conservatism. Do not overcorrect for momentary loss of a guide. Let the sky offer the next sign, then adjust. During the day, the sun steps into the same circle. It does not rise due east or set due west, except around the equinoxes. But its path provides a slow, reliable series of bearings. Morning sun angles confirm the course, and the navigator files those confirmations beside the memory of the night star sequence. The circle of the star compass, then, never goes unused. It is a 24-hour tool. Stars and planets at night, sun and swells by day, clouds filling in quietly, wind holding the background. On Satawal and neighboring islands, navigators long practiced on land before going far offshore. A teacher might sit in the shade and draw lines in the earth, marking the horizon's houses, then ask a student to stand, face a particular house, and call the star that belongs there in each season. The student would be corrected gently if they named a star out of place for that time of year. Over weeks, the student would learn sequences, a chain of stars that carry a steering line from dusk to midnight, another that carries it from midnight to dawn. They would also learn the latitudinal behavior of certain stars. Near the equator, some stars that are circumpolar in higher latitudes touch the horizon and return. Others dip below and vanish. The navigator internalizes these patterns, not with equations, but with repetition. The result is a memory grid matched to the sky's yearly cycles. The Polynesian revival adapted this, schooling in ways that fit local language and experience. In Hawaii, for example, navigators articulated a star compass with named houses around the horizon, assigning to each house a set of stars and star lines known by Hawaiian names, as well as widely used astronomical names. Training involved building a full circle on the ground, marking houses with stones or stakes, and walking the circle at the speed of the sky's turn. Students learn to see through clouds by rehearsing the order of rising stars. If Sirius would be next in the eastern house, they prepared to pick it up when the cloud opened. If Canopus would set soon in the southwest house, they readied. The transition to another guide. The pacing was steady, never rushed. The emphasis was always on building a habit that would stand up in ordinary, slightly messy conditions. The star compass works because the sky is regular enough to be trusted across centuries. Yet it also requires humility because apparent positions shift slightly through the year and storms can obscure the heavens for days. To handle these variations, navigators pair their circle of houses with other quiet instruments of the body. The swell becomes a companion compass, sometimes 2 or 3 swells, crossing at long angles, each with a different period. At night, when the eye tires, the feet and hips can hold the line, feeling the canoes rise and fall on a dominant swell, while the hands keep the steering sweep steady. When clouds block a section of sky, the helmsman keeps that bodily alignment, until some distant star breaks through in the same house and confirms the course. Another memory device integral to this way of working is the use of imagined reference points, often called by a term that has been translated as moving islands. In practice, the navigator chooses a real island far off the route and holds it in mind as the canoe travels. As stars pass across the zenith or near it, and as the swell maintains its slow, long lines, a navigator updates the imaginary position of that reference island relative to the canoe and to the guiding stars. Distance is not measured in miles, but in segments marked by the passage of known sky events, like a bright star reaching its highest point, and by the time it takes at a given speed. This systematic imagination keeps a dead reckoning track, not a number written in a log, but a lived position carried in the head. The star compass supplies the bearings needed to keep that picture coherent. From the outside, all of this can sound demanding. On board, it resolves into routines. Watches rotate. At the end of a watch, one person quietly lists the stars currently useful. The next one's due to rise or set in key houses, and any cloud, banks that might cover them. Another person reviews the swell directions and whether a secondary swell has grown or faded. A pot is set to warm a simple meal. A mat is laid where someone will sleep for the next few hours. The helmsman settles their stance, aligning hips and shoulders to the canoe's center line, eyes focused in the sector where the next guide star will appear. Each action is small, repeated, and stable. The slowest part of the work may be the memorization. That makes the star compass usable. People build this memory in plain ways. They recite star names aloud around the evening fire, in sequences that match the horizon. They quiz one another. Where does this star rise? In which house does it set? What follows it? They draw circles and mark points. They practice under a clear sky by lying on their back and tracing the rise and fall of arcs with a finger held out at arm's length. They learn not just the bright stars, but the dependable patterns. A crooked line that announces the arrival of a larger group, a pair that sits at a known tilt. Each small piece reduces the work of the night. Historical traces show how carefully this knowledge was maintained in places like the Central Carolines, where specialist schools carried it into successive generations. Ceremonies marked the conferring of responsibility on a navigator. In their roles, navigators were not simply helmsmen. They were planners, readers of seasons, and teachers. They decided when a voyage was appropriate, which routes made sense for the winds, how much food and water should be taken for a crew of a particular size, and how to adjust for the time of year when certain stars were high at dawn or as yet invisible at dusk. The star compass had a place in much of this planning because it remembered the relationship between the sky and the path over water. When Mo shared his knowledge with crews beyond his home region, he did so in the same unhurried mode. Accounts of his teaching describe long, quiet sessions pointing at the horizon, naming houses and stars, and then turning to the sea to feel the swell and learn its directions. The lesson was that none of these guides stands alone. A night might begin with a star in an eastern house, then move to a star in a slightly more northerly house as seasons and time move on, then end with a morning when clouds allow only a faint glow at dawn to set the last bearing. The navigator's skill is to accept this as normal and keep the thread unbroken. A person new to this might ask whether the star compass offers exactness. The answer is that it offers appropriate exactness for the canoe and the sea. It translates the sky into bearings that can be maintained by a human hand over long hours without instruments, with enough precision to cross hundreds or thousands of miles between archipelagos. When combined with a careful dead reckoning tradition 1, that tracks speed, time, and imagined reference points, this precision is sufficient to bring a canoe to the broad neighborhood of its destination. The last steps finding passes, avoiding reefs, are made by day with eyes, ears, and the other signs of sea and sky. The compass, at walking speed, brings you near. The rest is ordinary SEAMA and CHIP. The unremarkable qualities of the star compass are part of its appeal. It does not require measuring angles or solving problems at speed. It asks for discipline and steady attention. It gives the crew a shared language. In this house, that star. When it sets, the next one in the neighboring house. At dawn, the sun in that sector. It lets people coordinate without urgency. For a canoe with lashings and sails that prefer gradual adjustments to sudden ones, this style suits the material reality of voyage. Standing at the stern in the small hours. A helmsman might whisper the sequence for the remainder of the watch. This star until it is too high. Then the one just north of it. If clouds take both, hold the swell and wait for the pair that will rise before dawn. After that, shift to the thin line of the eastern light and prepare for day. The words are simple, but they keep hands and eyes tied to the horizon. They pass the time. They knit night to night so that a course remains a line, not a scatter of corrections. The legacy of teachers like Mo Pialig is found not only in famous voyages, but in the small persistence of this approach on boats today, both in the Pacific and beyond. People still walk circles on bare ground, naming houses and stars. Crews on modern canoes still step through the sequence when the sky clears. Watches still pass information in plane lists. It is a particular kind of memory work that seems designed for quiet minds and long tasks. It belongs to communities that measure success, not by a single dramatic arrival, but by repeated, safe passages. To see the star compass in this light is to recognize it as a schedule in the shape of a circle, shared among people who have agreed to move at the sky's speed. It turns the largest clock we know into a set of simple directions that a person can hold in the body and the tongue. It is learned slowly, used slowly, and valued for how it steadies a group in the ordinary hours of the night. What else about this circular way of holding direction shaped the teaching, leadership, and daily life around voyaging canoes? And how? Did those habits change as communities revived the practice in modern times? If you spend a week with a crew learning to steer by the star compass, the pace is steady from the start. There is no sudden mastery. People begin on land, often in a cleared space where someone has drawn a large circle and marked points around it. The marks need not be elaborate stones, shells, or stakes are enough. The circle becomes a small horizon. Students stand in it and point to where a familiar star would rise, then turn slowly and point to where it would set. They say the names aloud, not quickly, but with a rhythm that matches how the sky will present them later. This star at dusk in the east house. That star in the northeast house after midnight. A companion star to be ready for if clouds cover the first. The movement is not performance. It is rehearsal for ordinary hours on the water when the sky is imperfect and a person must switch calmly. From one guide to the next. One of the quiet strengths of this approach is that it uses fixed features of the Earth-sky relationship in very simple forms. Stars rise and set in consistent arcs. If a star rises north of east, it will set north of west. A star's height at its peak changes with latitude. Some touch the zenith only in certain bands of the Earth, and that makes them home markers. In Hawaii, for instance, the bright star Arcturus Huckley stands high in the sky in certain seasons, and became a useful emblem for a latitude band. In the far south, the Southern Cross helps show the South Point, its short arm and long arm forming a small, reliable signpost when seen above an empty horizon. Between these anchors, dozens of stars fill the night with practical directions. None of this is urgent. It is the slow predictability of the night that allows a person to learn it at. Walking speed dot planets are welcomed into this routine with a note of caution. Venus, very bright, can be a fine guide just before dawn or just after sunset. Jupiter and Mars, when bright, can serve too, but they wander relative to the fixed stars, shifting their rising and setting points through the months. So navigators, learn to use them by season and to be ready with alternatives when they move. The calm rule is simple. Take advantage of a bright guide if it fits the house you need tonight, and always keep a star-based sequence ready underneath it, like a spare. Rope coiled at hand. In teaching, the lists become friendly. Students chant sequences east to west by way of the night, or north to south by way of rising positions, until the order feels like an old song. Teachers have plain tricks to anchor memory. Pairs of stars that come one after another in the O. Same house in different seasons are grouped together in the mind, so that a person can say, when this one finishes its work in winter, that one takes its place in spring. Constellation shapes are used only as cues. A navigator might note that a crooked line announces the arrival of a larger group, but they care more about the group's rising place than the picture it makes. Their horizon is their frame. The stars are marks around it. At sea, the star compass stops being a drawing and becomes a schedule. Watches rotate through the night, and each watch begins with a quiet exchange. The helmsman coming off duty says, "We are steering by this star in this house. It will be high in 1 hour. After that, this other star rises in the neighboring house. If clouds come from the east bank, be ready to steer by the swell until the next star clears." The person taking the sweep repeats the sequence. The navigator listens and adds any adjustments needed because of a slow veer in the wind or a narrow gap in the clouds. Then the work proceeds. The boat holds the line as the next star rises into its place. Crew members learn to make small corrections rather than large ones. If a star rises north of the prow's line by a finger width at arm's length, the helmsman moves the bow that much and no more. If rain passes and the stars blur, the helm returns to the swell until the sky opens. The swell long, low, and regular becomes another circle of bearings laid under the star circle. When two swells cross at different angles, the helmsman chooses which one to ride by for this leg and holds to it with hips and shoulders, allowing the hands to follow. The quiet skill is in consistency. Each tiny adjustment, just enough to keep to the intended house. To keep the whole voyage in view without instruments. Navigators add the practice of reference points. In Micronesian traditions documented by scholars and sailors, navigators hold an off-route island in mind, treating it as if it were moving backward along the path as the canoe moves forward. Each time a set sky event occurs, a bright star passes high overhead, the navigator updates the imagined relative position of the canoe and the reference island. Speed estimates, based on days of feeling the boats run in various winds and seas, set the scale for how far the reference island should move. The practice turns time and sky into distance on an internal map. In some traditions, this is called by a term translated as reference island, and it gives the navigator a way to say, for example, "We are now a certain number of segments along the path past that island." It is a way of thinking that asks for a calm mind and persistent attention, not tools. The revival of voyaging in Polynesia made this mental mapping public again. Teachers adapted the circle and the reference practice for modern students, who often came with experience in sailing, but not with a head for star sequences. Exercises were devised that folded into daily life. On shore, people walked the circle and recited names. On board, they kept small ledgers spoken not written of speeds and times. Some crews used hour chants to count the time between notable sky events. Others paired an experienced helmsman with a novice, letting the novice call the star transitions while the experienced person kept the boat smooth, building confidence without drama. The most ordinary parts of this training are the ones that last. People learn to stand at the helm with a consistent posture so that their bodies don't introduce a drift into the steering. They learn to rest their eyes at the horizon between glances at a star so that they don't tire from staring upward. They learn to breathe steadily and to trade the sweep at agreed intervals so that no one's attention frays. They learn to check a coming star behind the sail, moving the head and shoulders slightly to find it early, the way a person might look around a post for a landmark on a street. These are small habits. They bring down the work to a human scale. Scholars who sailed with navigators in Micronesia and Polynesia in the 20th century left accounts of these quiet details. They wrote about schools where the horizon was taught as a set of named houses, and where students progressed through degrees of complexity from a few stars to many. They saw how a navigator's memory was not abstract, but practical. Lists of star pairs for a particular route, seasonal substitutions, and the double checks for when clouds intruded. One recurring emphasis was reluctance to decide on a single sign. If the sky provided a reading, navigators looked for confirmation in the swell and in a dead reckoning tally before altering course. That conservatism appears again and again not as hesitation, but as protection against a wrong turn that would cost days. On modern canoes, routines developed that made the star compass feel like part of ship's company rather than a separate art. At the beginning of a voyage, the navigator would brief the crew on expected sequences for the first week, which stars would carry the east to west line in the early night, which would be available nearer dawn, and which planets might offer help. People wrote the names on a board for practice during the day. At sunset, the board went away, and memory took over. Each night brought chances to test the mental order. A cloud would move across and take a star for half an hour, giving the helmsman practice in holding the swell and picking up the sequence when the star reappeared. In the morning, over a plain meal, the crew would review which expectations matched the sky and which needed adjusting for the season's small shifts. When winds required the canoe to hold a quartering course, neither straight downwind nor straight upwind, the star compass gave bearings that a person could keep by feel. The helmsman would aim the bow at a particular house, then check a guide star once every minute or two to make sure that the field lined up with the sky. If the star had slid to the side, the helmsman would make a slow correction. The correction would be small enough that the lashing of mast and spars did not complain. In this way, astronomy translated into strain savings on rope and wood. Crew members, aware that every sudden jolt could loosen a binding, appreciated the gentle, incremental steering that the night's regular stars made possible. The day did not forget the circle. The sun's path through the sky served as a slow pointer. Navigators knew that at certain times of the year, the sun's rising and setting places moved north or south along the horizon. They used that movement to confirm that their internal compass remained accurate. By mid-morning, a short glance at the sun's bearing relative to the boat's line would be enough to reassure the watch that they were holding true. If the sky was overcast, the faint edge of brightness in one sector sufficed. The habit of checking once an hour created a record in the mind without paperwork. The hours had markers, and those markers were shared among the crew through small statements. Night after night, the sequences accumulate into a simple confidence. It is not certainty in an abstract sense. It is the reassurance that if clouds cover the eastern houses now, the stars in the northern houses will be there a little later. That if a shower takes the south, the west will clear by midnight. That, if all are hidden for a time, the swell can be held without fuss until something breaks through. The navigator's role is to make this confidence public on board quietly, evenly. A steady voice that says, "Hold this. The next guide will rise soon in the left of the bow," helps everyone keep their work calm. There are slow administrative layers to this, and they matter. Before a voyage, teachers decide who will learn which sequences first. One person might take the first half of the night through to midnight. Another, the midnight to dawn segment. A third, the dawn transition. These roles rotate, but the specialization helps people memorize deeply. The boat's supplies are organized with the same patience. Water containers labeled by day, dry food set out so that the cook does not need light to find it during a watch change. Lashings inspected at morning and dusk when the light is soft, and reveals where. In a sense, the star compass sits inside this broader schedule, a device in a household that keeps everything moving at a manageable pace. When crews speak about Mo Piailug's teaching, they often mention that there was no rush. He pointed, named, and waited for people to see. He would stand at the stern and quietly test a student. What star will be next? If the student named it correctly, he would nod. If not, the correction was gentle, and the lesson moved on. He taught how to link the star sequence to the feel of the swell, and how to keep a track in the head by imagining an off-route island sliding by. He did not separate the parts. To him, each piece made sense only with the others. The effect on crews from outside his home tradition was practical. They learned a way to keep their boat running across long nights with modest demands on the mind and the body. Across the Pacific, other schools of knowledge held different names, and sometimes different lists, but the shape of the work was the same. In the Central Carolines, teachers organized the horizon into detailed sets of houses and trained memory with care, sometimes through formal rites. In Polynesian revivals, the circle took local forms, with names that fit language and place, and with stars grouped in ways that matched latitude and season. In both cases, the teaching was grounded in people standing together, pointing, reciting, and repeating until the order in the mind matched the order in the sky. There is something domestic in the image. A circle drawn in sand, children nearby, older people correcting with patience, a meal cooking, the sea beyond the trees. Navigation training did not remove itself from life. It sat inside it, like the work of drying nets or repairing a canoe's lashings. For outsiders who encounter these methods through books or exhibits, the star compass can look grand. But on board, its value is in the smallness of its demands. It fits into the quiet shift of a watch, into the routine of passing a bowl, into the moment of looking up between tasks. It is portable, durable, and light. It functions even when the crew is tired, because it breaks the night into pieces that hands and eyes can manage. It is, as many crafts are, a way to move calmly through a long job by focusing on the next small step dot at the edge of morning. When the last guide star fades and the first pale light shows in the east, the navigator makes one more exchange with the helmsman. Hold the brightness at this angle to the bow. When the sun clears, confirm the house. The day begins its own routines: cloud watching, swell comparisons, maintenance. The circle remains under everything, waiting for night, to return with the same measured pace. In learning and reviving this circular way of knowing, communities also revived a set of habits: shared recitation, gentle correction, routine confirmation, and the acceptance that large distances can be crossed through many small, steady acts. Those habits travel well beyond the canoe. They strengthen classrooms, shops, farms, and homes, because they teach people to organize time with patience and to hold direction without haste. What did the long practice of steering by this quiet circle mean for status, teaching roles, and community memory ashore? And how did crews adapt the circle to a world with modern tools without losing its calm usefulness. A circle drawn on the ground, a quiet list of star names, a watch passed with a few words. These are small acts, yet they travel far. The star compass, used at human pace through long nights, did more than carry canoes across ocean. It shaped how communities organized knowledge, authority, and memory. The effect was gradual, like the turning of the sky itself. A navigator's standing came from steady responsibilities rather than ceremony alone. In the Caroline Islands Satawal, Puluat, and other low coral atolls, the person who carried the star paths and the dead reckoning map in the mind also tended to the practical calendars of voyaging. That meant knowing which winds usually prevailed, in which months, which routes were most forgiving for a particular season, how much water a crew would need for a planned passage at a conservative speed, and which islands along or off the route could serve as fallbacks if weather closed in. Much of this knowledge was plain and administrative. Water containers were filled, sealed, and stacked by count. Dried breadfruit, taro, and fish were packed in a way that respected watch rotations. Lashings were inspected at morning and evening, when soft light showed wear. The star sequences for the upcoming nights were recited ahead of time so that tired minds would not hesitate at midnight. The horizon circle sat inside this larger circle of tasks. On Satawal, navigators were trained through a long apprenticeship that culminated in initiation. The Po ceremony, once limited to local lineages, signaled not a mystical transformation, but acceptance of duties. To guide safely, to teach carefully, to preserve the system of knowledge by passing it on in its right measure at the right time. In 2007, after decades of sharing his skills beyond his home atoll, Mo Pialag presided over a po on how Satawal for navigators from Micronesia and Hawaii. Crews had sailed the canoe Hokli and the newly built Alingano Maisu, presented to Mo across the western Pacific to reach that small island. The ceremony's quiet message was continuity. A circle of knowledge widened, then returned home. Those who received Pua'u took it as an obligation to teach and to steer with the same patience that had carried them there. The star compass lived in other Pacific languages and practices as well. In Hawaii, as voyaging revived in the 1970s and 1980s, teachers articulated a Hawaiian star compass with houses named in Hawaiian directional and wind terms points for east and west. 4. The trades that blow from the northeast for the gentler southerlies, for north and south. Stars were grouped accordingly. Arcturus as Hokli, high and reassuring in certain seasons. Canopus with its low southern sweep. The Pleiades Makali in Hawaiian, Matariki and Bori marking seasonal change when they returned to the dawn. This localization was not a departure from the Carolinian method. It was a respectful fitting of a shared principle to place and language. The circle could carry many names, so long as it kept the night's schedule clear to the hands at the helm. Ashore, the circle entered classrooms, not as a grand symbol, but as a teaching device that children could walk. In a schoolyard, a teacher would lay out stones for the houses and have students take a few steps with the turning of the sky, naming what would rise and set. They would learn a handful of star and planet names first, then more. The exercise required no instruments and little cost. It taught the habit of gentle confirmation. Say it, check it, say it again tomorrow. On weekend sails between islands, the same students would point to the sector of horizon where the next guide would appear. The effect over years was cumulative. The compass became part of daily speech, orbiting through language revival, canoe building, and community events that treated voyaging not as spectacle, but as a craft with chores and schedules. In Micronesia, the star compass sat within exchange systems that had their own calm routines. Voyages linked atolls to larger islands in networks of tribute and trade. In the Western Carolines, ties between outer islands and Yap moved goods and people along known routes over seasons, and navigators were the organizers who made those schedules reliable. The Saway network, long studied by anthropologists, depended on regular crossings that respected the winds and the periods when seas were most manageable. The star paths organized the legs of those routes. The day-to-day logistics, water, food, sail repairs made them practical. Each reinforced the other, converting celestial cycles into community timetables. Communities recorded the sky's steady marks in ways that mingled work and story. The heliacal rising of certain stars or clusters, for example, the first dawn. Appearance of Makali Matariki marked seasons for planting, fishing, and festivities across parts of Polynesia. In Hawaii and in Aotearoa, the reappearance of that little cluster signaled a new year for many. The same event that helped a navigator anticipate a sequence in the night also helped the farmer anticipate rain and a fisher anticipate runs. The skies circled tide, shore, and sea together without drama, just as a calendar hung in a kitchen ties a household's meals and errands to the month. Navigators' role came with limits that were themselves practical. Sky and sea are not always legible. There are weeks when weather hides stars and flattens the swell into confused chop. In those times, communities expected caution. Voyages waited. In the revival, canoes set conservative rules. Leave only with an acceptable forecast. Carry modern safety gear sealed in a locker. Agree that non-instrument navigation would guide the canoe while the emergency equipment stood by for need. The principle was not to test tradition against danger, but to let tradition work inside a safety frame appropriate to the present. Crews learned to switch off electronic aids for training and switch them on when prudence demanded. The star compass was not diminished by this. It was respected for what it does best: steady human, steering through ordinary conditions and backed up sensibly when conditions became extraordinary. The adaptation to modern life also changed who held the circle. In earlier generations in some regions, training skewed male and specialized. In the revival, crews broadened. Women learned and taught star houses, steered long night watches, and led voyages. Navigators such as Lihua Kamalu have captained across oceans using the same slow sequences, showing that the craft thrives when more hands share it. The circle's strength lies in its simplicity and in the community habits that surround it. Watch changes, shared recitations, gentle corrections. Those habits are portable. They fit any crew that agrees to move at the sky's speed. Leadership around canoes reflected the method's quietness. On board, a head navigator made calls about course and timing, but decisions were explained with reasons anyone could see. We will hold this house for 2 hours. Then this star will rise. The wind may veer a little with the approaching clouds. We will ease the sheet slightly at midnight. Ashore, the same person often led planning that looked uneventful but proved decisive. Which families could contribute? Fiber for lashings this season? Which school would host star circle lessons? Which fishermen had observations about a route's currents that could be folded into training? The star compass was not separable from this steady administrative life. It gave it shape. When the double-hulled canoe Hok Lee made its early voyages under non-instrument navigation in the 1970s and 1980s, and then set out later on longer routes, the public often saw headlines about daring crossings. Crews, however, described routines. They spoke about how a night's sequence of stars broke the darkness into manageable steps, how a person new to steering could be given one house to keep for an hour and succeed, how the swell underfoot verified what the sky said, and how the sunrise checked the previous night's work with a slow, reassuring line. The method traveled outward. Other canoes were built. Other communities revived local names and practices, and the circle spun quietly over many decks, from Hawaii to Aotearoa to the Cook Islands and back through Micronesia. Mo Piailogs. Legacy sits within this ordinariness. He carried his island's teaching in a protective way, sharing carefully and always insisting that the whole craft, not just stars, not just swells, be taught together with the ethics of patience and caution. He showed that the star compass is not something you own. It is something you keep for a while and pass on. The 2007 poll reminded everyone present that the point of revival is not romance. It is to make useful skills common again under leaders who can keep them safe and clear. In later years, as other navigators taught circles in their own languages and adapted them to different latitudes, the work remained faithful to this tone: slow, inclusive, and careful. If you walk through a voyaging program today in the Pacific, you are likely to see the star compass folded into many small activities. In the morning, someone sweeps a classroom circle clear and sets stones for houses. In the afternoon, students practice pronouncing names in their heritage language, and in the widely used astronomical terms, connecting both. On a weekend, a crew paints house marks faintly on the inside rail of a canoe as a training aid, then covers them with mats so that night practice still relies on memory. In a meeting, elders discuss which months will be best for a teaching sail based on the seasonal arc of winds and the expected visibility of certain guide stars. None of this is dramatic. It is community maintenance, like tending a fish pond's walls or relashing a roof. Because the circle is simple, it extends comfortably into other kinds of work. Farmers use the reappearance of Makali Matareki to time tasks. Fishermen talk about how the wind in a given house affects runs along a reef. Families plan ceremonies and gatherings with an eye on seasons when weather is most stable. The star compass is not a device only for the stern of a canoe. It is a way of aligning life with something predictable and shared. It gives people a common set of words for direction that feels closer to wind and water than to the needle of a metal instrument. For communities that have experienced interruption colonial rule, language loss, displacement is shared. Embodied method offers a quiet anchor. For those who ask about accuracy, the answer remains in the scale of the task. The star compass guides a canoe between archipelagos by giving bearings that a person can hold over hours without straying. It pairs with dead reckoning that tracks distance by speed and time, using the passage of known sky events as markers. It is backed by a habit of cross-checking with swells, birds, clouds, and the sun. When practiced with patience, it yields landfalls not as surprises, but as the last step in a long chain of small confirmations. In modern programs, crews sometimes compare their nightly estimates to GPS plots after the fact, not to replace their method, but to calibrate their sense of speed and drift. This creates a feedback loop, traditional practice sharpened by occasional modern comparison, then practiced again without instruments. The rhythm suits the craft's long memory. The star compass also offers a modest lesson in leadership style. It rewards teachers who set a pace that others can keep. It values repetition over display. It turns knowledge into a shared schedule rather than a private secret. When used to steer a canoe over weeks, it pulls people's attention outward toward common cues: a star rising, a swell running, a line of dawn brightness, so that individuals align without being told at every moment what to do. In households, shops, and schools, the same style functions well. Name the next guide, move toward it together, and allow small corrections to accumulate into a long, accurate path dot by the time a canoe nears its destination after a long passage. The circle has done quiet work for many nights. The helmsmen have followed sequences of guides over and over. The navigator has kept the internal track anchored to imaginary reference points and real sky events. The crew has kept water and food in order around that clock. At dawn on the last day, the sun rises in the house expected. Birds cross the bow on their known commute. The swell's angle shifts slightly as it feels the edge of a shelf. A faint arc of cloud holds in one sector. The bow points where it should. The shoreline appears as a thin, dark band. People continue with ordinary tasks, coiling rope, preparing. A small meal, checking lashings, because the arrival is not a surprise. It is the natural result of patient attention to a circle. Stepping ashore, the navigator takes up another role that looks uneventful and necessary. Debriefing with the crew, thanking those who prepared the canoe, reporting quietly to elders on what the sky did during the passage, which sequences proved most useful, which substitutions worked when clouds came, and what should be taught next to improve the next watch's calm. The compass continues to turn, now in speech, now in the planning table, now in the circle marked in a schoolyard. The night's schedule becomes the community's schedule again. If there is a single legacy to hold gently from this story, it is that large distances and long projects yield to small, repeated acts kept in an agreed order. A star compass is no more mysterious than that. It is a ring of reminders that keep people facing together in a direction that slowly changes a human-sized way to live with a vast sky. How else might the sea's quiet patterns have been made? Into tools by islanders, especially in the daily reading of waves and currents that never stop. In the Marshall Islands, the sea is busy in a way that is not obvious at first glance. If you sit by a lagoon pass in the early morning, the surface can look calm, ruffled only by trade wind ripples. But under that top layer, long, steady swells run with their own schedules. They slide through gaps, bend around reefs, and meet each other in patterns that repeat day after day. For generations, Marshallese sailors learned to treat these patterns as lines, quiet, dependable lines that guide a canoe from atoll to atoll. The stick charts that outsiders saw, and sometimes carried away to museums, were not trophies or ornaments. They were teaching tools for these invisible roads. The Marshalls stretch in two long chains, the Raddick Sunrise Group in the east and the Raleigh Sunset Group in the west, spanning a region where the trade winds blow most of the year. The islands are low, ring-shaped atolls with narrow rims of land and wide central lagoons. There are no mountains to wear cloud hats as loud signals, no high cliffs to loom above the horizon at long distance. The cues for travel are smaller. A navigator in a Marshallese canoe, its outrigger skimming the chop, learns to read the small, steady heave of the long swell beneath the wind wave. They also learn to feel how that long swell changes when it passes an atoll, how it reflects and refracts, how 2 or 3 swells cross to make an alternating pattern in the hull. Outsiders gave the charts many descriptions. They noticed that the frames were made from thin sticks, often coconut midribs or other light, straight bits lashed with cord. Cowrie shells or knots marked island positions. Crossed sticks, curved ribs, and parallel lines looked to some like a net for catching fish or a ladder laid flat. The names for the charts, which have been recorded in Marshallese, organized them by purpose. One, often called the Metang, is a teaching chart that shows the way swells behave around a single island, the bending of waves, the zones of disturbance, the way a long swell splits and rejoins as it slides past a reef. Another type, the Meadow, depicts part of the island group, a handful of atolls and the swell lines between them. A larger chart, the Rebelib, covers a broad span of the 2 chains. These charts are not drawn to scale in our modern sense, nor are they carried to sea for reference like a pilot's map. They are studied on land, memorized, and set aside. The point is not to look at them while sailing. The point is to train the mind to expect how the sea will feel in certain places, and to know which steady lines will lead to land out. The material of the charts tells its own story. The sticks are light because the knowledge is not meant to be heavy. Coconut fiber lashings sennet made by twisting and braiding tie the joints. A familiar craft that also holds together canoe hulls and house frames. Shells mark islands because they sit easily on the intersections. A chart is built and rebuilt. In a men's house, set out on the floor and adjusted as older navigators, correct a young person's understanding. The swell from this season comes from here. The reflected line will feel stronger there. Between these two atolls lies a lane where the heave becomes even. The corrections are not dramatic. They are a finger moved a little, a bit of cord retied, a curved stick bent just so. The chart grows precise by trial and by patient talk. On the water, the same patience becomes a kind of ledger that lives in the body. A helmsman stands slightly turned to feel both the pitch and the roll of the canoe. The outrigger floats on the windward side in Marshallese craft, which are asymmetric, with the hull's long side and the outrigger balancing the sail's pull. The person at the steering blade senses the difference between the short slap of wind waves and the longer, deeper rise of the swell. If a swell runs from the northeast, as it often does in the trades, it will lift and lower the bow at a steady interval. A second swell, perhaps from the east or southeast, will cross that. Rhythm, adding a side-to-side roll. Where these swells interact, the canoe experiences a slow alternation. A few minutes when the ride feels smooth and almost level, then a few minutes when the roll grows, then back again. The alternation is not random. It repeats with a period, set by the difference between the swells. Navigators learn to count that period without counting. They let their bodies log it as a background beat while they keep the canoe on a line. This is the line that Marshallese navigators have described to researchers with a plain word that translates roughly as a backbone, a path where two swell. Systems interact in a way that steadies the motion, guiding a canoe between atolls. The idea, known in modern writing by the Marshallese term dial-up, is not a mystical channel. It is a physical effect. Swells passing and repassing reflect from the reefs of two islands and interfere with each other, creating a series of zones where the combined motion eases or strengthens in a predictable pattern. A navigator heading along this spine adjusts the bow to keep the canoe in the smoothest belt, sometimes by a few degrees, sometimes by a subtle shift of weight and sail. If the belt begins to wander, the helmsman knows to expect a certain kind of heave again after a few minutes. In this way, motion itself becomes a map. People have tried to put this into instruments. In recent decades, Marshallese navigators and scholars working together set out with small accelerometers and recorders on canoes to test whether the patterns they felt could be seen in data. The results showed what the practitioners had long said: slow, repeating rhythms in pitch and roll align with routes between atolls when swell and wind are in certain arrangements. The numbers are interesting. The more important part for daily life is the routine. A person at the helm knows that if a long passage is underway, they must keep to a patient practice. Hold the feel of the backbone, check the angle of the wind, glance at the color of the sky, watch for birds at dawn and dusk. The stick chart sits in memory under all of this as a framework. It keeps the details in order. The daily life around this knowledge looks ordinary. Canoes are maintained, lashings checked, sails patched, and food prepared in ways that line up with the wind's habits. On Majuro, Arno, Jaluit, and the smaller atolls, people have long moved by canoe between villages and islets, through passes that cut from lagoon to ocean. The same attention to swell needed for ocean routes keeps people safe at the pass. Those who steer learn to feel the pull of the outgoing tide, the push of incoming swell, and the quiet shift that happens when a trade wind gust lifts a foam line at the edge. They time trips by the tide's taste and by the wind's angle. Early starts under a steady breeze, returns before the afternoon strengthens it. These are not dramatic choices. They are steady ones that keep work predictable. The wind itself is a subject and a companion. In the trade season, Northeast to east winds simplify decisions. The swell. Field is neat, with a dominant long line from one quarter. In other months, disturbances to the west send swells from different angles, and the net of lines on a teaching chart grows more tangled. Navigators know to weigh their options then. Routes that use sheltered paths, departures that wait for a cleaner pattern, speeds adjusted to fit a sea that is speaking 2 or 3 dialects at once. In this way, the stick chart's abstract lines become a schedule. General routes chosen for general winds, with families expecting arrivals and departures in reasonable windows. When European visitors wrote about the marshals in the 19th century, they noticed fast canoes' proas that could skim along with the outrigger to windward and made quick work of passages that Europeans in deeper vessels found more tedious. Some wrote about the way Marshallese sailors steered by swells, even when the sky hid the stars or the land was out of sight. German colonial administrators and ethnographers, who governed the islands for a time before the First World War, collected stick charts and published descriptions and illustrations. The charts traveled to museums in Europe. In the process, an object left its home, and a method became a subject of study. Yet at home, the craft continued where it could, passed by practice rather than display. The chart's purposes were never single. The small teaching chart, the Matang, gave clear lessons about what to expect around any island. A student could see how the long swell bends, where eddies might form, and where chop appears because of reflected waves. The Meadow and Rebelib offered the larger picture. Paths between atolls, the way a canoe might leave the lee of one island, cross a zone of regular swell, and then enter the reach of another island's reflected lines. A person who learned these charts also learned the seasons, because the patterns differ with the time of year. Knowledge of breadfruit harvesting, pandanus drying, and the times of fish runs came with the same sense of season, and so the charts sat naturally inside community routines about work and travel. On shore, the making of a chart was itself a lesson in modest craft. Thin sticks were cut, shells selected, and string prepared. The person building the chart tied joints, then slid them along to adjust angles. Young people watched and were asked small questions. If the wind is here, what will the swell do around this corner? What do you think it will feel like on the hull? They might be asked to walk a hand along a stick and tap where they thought the smoother belt would pass. Later, they would test their guess at sea, standing at the bow with eyes half closed to. Listen with their feet. If their guess fit the sea, the teacher would nod. If not, the student would adjust quietly and try again on another day. The stakes were not examination scores. They were confidence on the water and dependable connections between islands in daily life. Over the 20th century, the world around the Marshalls changed sharply. Colonial regimes shifted. War came and went. New technologies, engines, radios, metal boats arrived. Navigation by charts of wood and cord, by swell lines felt through a hull, seemed to outsiders to belong to an earlier era. Yet on many atolls, the same conditions that made the old method practical still mattered. Passes can still be narrow. Fuel can still be scarce or expensive. A sail and an outrigger still move a family or a cargo of mats just as surely as a motor, with less noise and less cost. In recent decades, a quiet revival of canoe building and sailing in the Marshalls and across Micronesia has brought teaching houses to life again. Programs dedicated to canoe culture have taught young people to carve, lash, rig, and steer. The stick charts have returned to their place, not as curiosities in a glass case, but as training aids on the floor where people sit, cross-legged, and plan routes for next week. The senses used in this training are modest ones. Students learn to feel the interval between swells by the way water slides along the hull. They learn the weight of a steering paddle and how a small angle change makes a large difference over an hour. They learn to sleep in turns, to wake without. Hurry, to cook simple food under a sail's shade when the wind is fair, and to stow it before squalls. They learn to scan a horizon not for drama, but for small signs. A slightly darker line that could be a cloud bank, a pair of birds making. A straight commute toward evening, a place in the sea where the surface texture changes. The stick chart's lines prepared them for these observations by giving a mental scaffold to hang them on. Atolls have their individual characters, and that shows up in the way swells behave. A long, smooth rim of reef produces a different reflection, and a jagged one with many gaps. A wide lagoon with multiple passes breathes differently than a tight, shallow one. Navigators know the feel of their home atoll's shadow in the sea and the feel of neighboring shadows. When that knowledge is plotted on a meadow, the lines that look abstract on land become familiar paths at sea. The canoe can ride a smoother belt that runs in a slight curve, taking advantage of one atoll's reflection, then step across to another belt, favored by the next atoll, arriving with less strain on lashings and crew. The canoe itself supports this way of travel. Marshallese sailing canoes are light for their length, with a single outrigger and a crab claw sail. The rig allows quick tacks and shunts, changing ends so that the bow becomes stern and vice versa, without swinging the hull around. This flexibility lets a sailor keep the outrigger to windward, a safety habit, and makes fine adjustments easier when following a swell line that bends. The hull's asymmetry, combined with the outrigger float, rests naturally in the long swell, translating sea patterns into clear signals in the hands and feet. It is a design born from the same environment that produced the charts. Some parts of the practice do not tolerate hurry. Finding the backbone between atolls requires time on the water and a willingness to accept uncertain minutes. A navigator will say, "Hold this for a while." The smoother belt will come back, and they will wait to see if the alternation returns as expected. If it does, they stay with it. If it does not, they slide gently to one side and test the feel again. A person steering learns to avoid the urge to chase short-term smoothness. They learn to prefer the longer pattern, the one that repeats across hours, because that is the line that brings them to a landfall with fewer surprises. This is not dramatic seamanship. It is the endurance of small corrections added up. When people describe the stick charts, they sometimes ask how accurate they are. The answer depends on what is meant by accuracy. If one expects a scaled map with measured angles and distances, the charts will seem imprecise. If one expects a guide to where the sea will be kind enough to carry a canoe over long routes with the least stress, then the charts are accurate in the way a well-worn footpath is accurate. They represent relationships that matter and omit details that do not. They remind the walker to trust the feel of the ground when the trees obscure a view. They ask for attention to the right things at the right times. Alongside the charts and the swell lines, the Marshallese navigation repertoire includes the same companions we have met elsewhere: stars at night, birds at dawn, clouds by day. Because the islands are low and the sky can be ambiguous, the sea itself often carries the heavier part of the work. In this mix, the charts stand out not as a separate technology, but as a bridge between land and water. They make the intangible tangible enough to teach. A child can touch a line on a chart, then go to sea and feel a similar line under their feet. A teacher can say, "Here is where you will feel the canoe ease," and then show it the next week between Ailinglap and Namu, or between Majuro and Arno. Not by pointing at the horizon, but by asking a student to stand and listen to the whole dot in the long view. This craft fits into a larger pattern of island life. Work that respects rhythms, tools that leave room for the senses, and knowledge passed, more by patient repetition than by spectacle. The charts have traveled in and out of museums and books, but their main life is still on the floor of a meeting house and in the motion of a canoe. Quietly, they turn swell and wind into routes that families can count on, and they reduce the ocean's size to something that fits a person's attention. What other everyday habits, ashore and afloat, did this wave mapping swells foster among Marshallese communities? And how did navigators adjust their routines when seasons shifted and new tools appeared? If you return to the same canoe house day after day in the Marshall Islands during a season of steady trades, you would see a routine that leaves little to chance. A bundle of thin midribs is brought out and sorted by straightness. A coil of sennet is untied and inspected. Shells or small knots of fiber are set within reach. The floor is swept smooth. Someone lays the first 2 sticks for a frame, lashes the corners, then adds crossings and curves that mean more than they seem. The making of a stick chart is not performance. It is a lesson in slow lines and the way the sea keeps the habits. Charts often begin with the matang, the teaching diagram for what a single island does to a long swell. In quiet conversation, an older navigator shows a younger person how a straight swell line bends as it meets the reef rim and passes a lagoon. Entrance. They mark zones where reflected waves return to meet incoming ones, and places where the interference is strongest or softest. The parts have names in Marshallese that carry practical meanings taught face to face. The student learns to imagine how the hull will feel in each zone. A double beat where 2 swells cross, a leveling where the rhythms match and cancel. The chart gives a vocabulary for a motion underfoot it is hard to describe otherwise. Then the work shifts to meadow charts, sections of the island groups with paths between a handful of atolls, and to Rebellibe charts that span a wide reach. Of the Raddock and Rallick chains, the older person places shells for Majuro and Arno, for Jaluit and Kili, for Likip, Wachi, Ailinglap, Namu, and the others that mark the home region. Curved and crossed sticks show the belts where the motion eases, the lines that a canoe can follow with less strain, and the places to expect confusion when swells from different seasons meet. The student is not asked to memorize a picture. They are invited to walk a hand along a line and say what the sea will do there. If they guess wrongly, a joint is shifted slightly, a curve adjusted, and they guess tried again next week at sea. When the canoe runs that path out at sea, the lesson becomes ordinary work. A helmsman stands where the steering blade transmits the hull's rise and fall most clearly. In Marshallese canoes, which keep the outrigger to windward through shunting, rather than tacking, the balance is particular. The boat likes a long swell. With the trades in season, a swell from the northeast runs steady, and a second line often comes from the east or east-southeast. The 2 make a pattern that repeats in the body. A few minutes of smooth run, a few of roll, and back again. The navigator talks about a backbone, a belt of combined motion that runs between atolls, and the crew learns to hold it. If the belt wanders, they do not chase every momentary lull. They wait for the longer easing they know will come back if they are still on the line. Over an hour, this patience saves energy and keeps lashings from feeling sharp loads. That belt has become known in English writing by the Marshallese term dilip, recorded by navigators and scholars who worked together in recent decades to document what the hands and feet had known for generations. When researchers placed small instruments on canoes to record how they moved over these routes, the traces showed slow, repeating rhythms in pitch and roll where sailors said the belt ran. The instruments were new. The pattern was not. The quiet point for daily life is that the belt is not a drawn road. It is a comfortable compromise between swells shaped by 2 or more atolls, and it moves with the seasons and with the wind. Seasons matter more than most visitors realize. In the northern winter months, long-period swells can arrive from faraway North Pacific storms and slide into the Marshalls from the north or northwest, adding a third line to the common trades. In boreal summer, The southern hemisphere can send long, low swells that arrive from the south or southwest. Each seasonal visitor shifts the balance. A route that feels simple in steady trades, the belt line neatly between two atolls can feel busier when a new line slants across the familiar pattern. Navigators plan around these changes with steady preferences rather than hard rules, favoring routes that sit in the lee of a chain when outside swells grow, departing when the wind sets the long swell from a helpful quarter, delaying when the belts look confused. Families at home accept this flexibility because they share the same calendar of wind and sea. On a short but common run Majuro to Arno, across an expanse that many canoes have crossed, you can picture the practice. The canoe leaves the lagoon, passes with the morning breeze, and meets the outside swell. The helmsman feels for the belt expected from the chart, a comfortable motion running between these two atolls when the trades are from the east-northeast. For a few minutes the deck rolls more. For a few, it steadies. The helmsman stays with the steadier belt when it returns. A child on board learns to tell the difference by standing barefoot near the mast. On this route, birds help at dawn and late afternoon, flying their steady commute. By midday, the sky is high and plain. The set of the swell and the gentle alternation in the hull do most of the guiding work. The chart is not consulted. It is already aboard as a pattern in the mind. And feet, farther south in the chain, a longer passage from Ailinglap toward Namu in the Rallick group gives a stronger lesson. With a clean trade season, the belt feels like a shoulder that a canoe can lean on, curving slightly with the line of the chain. When another swell arrives at a slant, the belt widens and thins. The navigator tells the helmsman to keep course. By the averaged feel, stay with the smoother part. Let the rough patches pass. It will come back. A hasty hand would zigzag after every lull. A trained hand keeps a steady small correction and trusts that the line will settle again. The difference between those two styles appears as fatigue at day's end, and as wear on lashings over weeks. Training the senses to this steady pitch takes time. In the canoe house, a teacher might set a small practice. 3 people stand in, the hull on blocks while someone gently rocks the frame at 2 different tempos. The students learn to name which tempo dominates. They practice closing their eyes and feeling when the alternation shifts. They practice speaking what they feel without argument. Now the longer rise is coming on again, now the short. Slap comes back stronger. They are not tested for speed, but for steadiness. They are building a way to hold a rhythm lightly enough that a small, slow change does not confuse them. On the water, the same people take turns at the steering blade, counting in their head, not to measure, but to keep attention paced. The stick chart sits behind these drills as a map that is not literal. A shell on the chart does not sit exactly, where an island sits on a survey map. A curved stick does not fix a precise arc on the ocean. Instead, the chart selects what matters for a person who will stand at the helm, where the feel eases, where it grows busy, which line to prefer when 2 are offered, and how that preference changes when the season turns. It is a planning tool, in the original sense, helping people decide in advance which routes to expect and what their bodies should look for. The charts also support a style of instruction that is domestic and continuous. In a corner of the canoe house, mats are rolled and unrolled for families who gather while work goes on. Children hear the older people repeat the same points. This pass runs strong on the ebb. That reef throws back a sharp chop in the afternoon trades. This route will be rougher next month when a northern swell adds its say. The lists are not dramatic. They are a steady reminder that ocean travel here has a timetable tied to the sky and to distant storms that never come near. As people eat a small meal-dry breadfruit, fish cooked simply the talk returns to which lines are comfortable this week and which should be left. alone until the season changes, because the canoes are light and their parts are held by lashings. The navigation and the maintenance meet in a practical way. A day's steering that leans into the smoother belt puts smaller, steadier loads on the connections that hold the outrigger booms, mast, and hull together. Lashings are inspected each morning and afternoon when the light angle shows wear. If a lashing has begun to chafe, a small change in course that follows the gentler swell can make the difference between a repair at sea and a repair at anchor. In this sense, the stick chart's lines are not only routes in the mind, but also instructions for honoring the canoe's fabric. People who keep to those lines need fewer emergency relashings and can schedule their maintenance during the quiet parts of the day. Modern life did not erase these routines. Engines came, metal boats arrived, fiberglass hulls appeared. But seas remain seas, and passes are still shaped by reef and tide. Many families alternate between motorboats and sailing canoes, depending on cost, cargo, and season. Even in a motorboat, a person steering learns to keep a steady angle to the long swell to avoid pounding the bow and burning extra fuel. The stick chart's logic carries over. Choose the lane where motion eases, and the boat and people will be less tired. Programs. In the islands that teach canoe building and sailing, well known in Najurao and other atolls, fold this into their lessons. Students lash spars, shape hull pieces, and then go out to feel the belt on familiar routes. They return to the chart on the floor, can adjust a line because the sea taught them a small correction. In this way, the chart and the canoe talk to each other through human hands. Scholars who worked closely with Marshallese navigators in the early 21st century recorded not just the ideas, but the tempo of instruction. They describe long days on the lagoon and outside the reef, apprentices taking turns to call out when the belt returned, and elders correcting gently. They brought along small devices to measure motion because outsiders asked for proof, and the traces were shown to the navigators, who nodded at the familiar cycles. The research served a local purpose too. It made it easier to convince schools and councils to support canoe programs when they could point to records that matched lived knowledge. The point, however, remained the practice itself, which has survived, because it fits daily needs and the local way of organizing work. Because the islands are low, other signs share the duty. Birds, especially terns and noddies, mark the direction of roosts and feeding grounds at predictable hours. A steady line of birds near evening aligns with a belt between two atolls more often than chance would suggest. Cloud reading is quieter here than over high volcanic islands, but navigators still note a faint pile or a low, even bank that suggests a lagoon-breathing moisture. Smell plays a modest role when approaching large atoll complexes from windward. Yet on many days, the swell and its interference remain the cleanest guides, so charts devote most of their attention to that language. The charts encourage a particular kind of caution. Navigators are taught not to change course for short term. Comfort without a reason that fits the chart's longer lines. They are taught to leave at dawn for routes that are simpler in morning wind, to approach passes at slack tide, to avoid the edges of the belt where the reflected chop bites hardest, and to avoid night approaches unless the route can pass are very familiar. This caution is not fear. It is a way of aligning small choices with patterns that are already in place, so that surprises are few and recoverable. Ashore, the same logic organizes errands and visits. A family planning to send mats and fish to a neighboring atoll chooses a day when the belt will be friendly and the timing will put them at the pass without the tide against them. They plan not by a printed timetable, but by a chain of plain statements. Tomorrow, with this wind, a smoother line lies here. Leave after sunrise. Arrive by noon. Return before the afternoon gusts. The stick chart has done its work already by making these statements easy to agree upon. In a year when the trades falter and weather grows unsettled, navigators adapt their routines without ceremony. They pull the charts back out, sit on the floor, and move a curved stick a little to match what the sea has been saying lately. A line that felt centered last month now feels off to one side. The correction is small. The teaching that follows is smaller still. Expect the belt to lie here for now. We will move again when the season turns. In this way, the chart remains a living thing, a collection of small adjustments rather than a fixed picture. The story of stick charts in museums sits alongside this living work. Early collectors took them far away, sometimes with notes, sometimes without. Drawings were published in European languages, and the charts were offered as curiosities. Later, as Marshallese canoe programs grew and scholars partnered with navigators, photographs and recordings came back to the islands as teaching aids. Young people could see their own craft in books and films, and then handle the same lashings and sticks on the floor. The circle of knowledge widened and returned, guided by the same steady tone as before. Because the charts focus attention on swell, they shape what is valued in a sailor. A good helmsman is not the one who makes a fast dash through a rough patch. It is the one who keeps the boat in the smoother belt for hours without making it a subject of strain, who hands over the steering blade at watch change with a simple sentence: "Hold this feel. The long line will return in a few minutes." Apprentices who can say the same and mean it find themselves trusted. Their names are passed along when another family asks for someone to carry a cargo. In this way, the chart's long lines become social lines, quiet reputations built on calm performance. It is easy, looking from afar, to think of these charts as relics. They are not. They are working notes in another medium. They turn a landscape with few tall markers into a place with many. They allow people to make plans that respect the stamina of hands and the limits of lashings. They build a picture of the sea that is not abstract, a picture you can stand on and feel. The work around them is never showy. It settles into schedules, chores, and small decisions that make travel uneventful, and in an island world where water lies between most things, uneventful is a quiet achievement. In the background of all this, the wind continues its long habits with small variations. A change of a few degrees in its angle lengthens or shortens the easy belts. A shift in distant storm tracks brings a new swell that asks for a slight adjustment of route. Navigators accept these changes as ordinary, fold them into the chart, and keep the same teaching rhythm. The sea remains readable because people agree to read it at the pace it offers. What other parts of Marshallese life crafts, exchanges, and community planning grew from this careful listening to swells? And how did navigators bring the practice to a close when a voyage met its landfall and the work turned back to shore? A stick chart, once learned on the floor of a canoe house, lives on in many small decisions that bring a voyage to a neat close. The canoe has followed a smoother belt between atolls, the long swell kept under the hull at a comfortable angle. The alternation of roll and ease counted without numbers. As land draws near, the knowledge that was memorized from curved sticks and shell markers becomes practical at a handful of quiet steps. Choosing the right approach, reading the pass, and handing the canoe back to shore life without fuss. Approach begins far out. The sea's motion changes slightly as shallow shells reach farther than the eye can see. The long pulse of the swell grows shorter and more emphatic. The sound of surf is still only a suggestion, carried on the wind, but a helmsman hears it, the way you might hear a distant crowd before seeing a town. Birds appear with more purpose, running steady lines back toward evening roosts. If the wind is fair, a faint scent, the green breath of land and lagoon, comes and goes. None of these signals is dramatic. Each simply adds a small weight to a conclusion that the chart and the body have been forming for hours. The belt you've followed will deliver you to the lee of a rim, and the pass you want lies a little to one side of where the motion feels. Most even, atolls are practical places. Their passes have personalities. Some carry a strong ebb at certain tides. Some cheat to one side with a crosswind. Some wear a line of foam that shows where the flow pinches. Navigators plan to enter by day, preferably at slack water or on a gentle flood. The stick chart does not show the pass. It shows the line that brings you near without tiring the canoe. Once you are upon the place, the method becomes ordinary. Seamanship. A lead line or a pole confirms depth. Color in the water shifts from dark to pale as a sand patch opens. The helmsman holds a steady small angle to the outflow so the boat does not crab sideways. A second hand stands ready at the sheet to ease or trim as puffs come down the channel. The canoe slides through and into the lagoon's smoother water. The gear is set away from spray and conversation resumes. Closing a voyage is administrated in the best sense. Sails are dried and rolled. Lashings are rinsed of salt and inspected where they pass over wood. Small repairs are made before they become large. Water containers are counted and notations made spoken, usually about how much was used on a run of this distance in this season, with wind of this strength. A navigator might note how the belt lay a little east this time and suggest a small adjustment to the meadow on the floor. No one is surprised. Charts are not monuments. They are living notes that move with the sea's habits. A shell shifts a finger width on the frame. A curved stick is bent slightly. A few words are added to the simple sentence that will guide the next departure. With this wind, the smoother line runs here first, and it eases back. The rest of the work is village work. Cargoes carried bundles of mats, fish, pandanus, leaves for weaving, cooking stones picked up at one end and set down at the other with small greetings. Families exchange errands and news. Plans are made to run over to a neighboring islet tomorrow before the afternoon breeze freshens. Children tramp through the shallows to meet the canoe and learn to keep clear of the outrigger's float. The sea remains present, but the tone changes from passage to household. It is here, amid these modest transactions, that the charts have their quiet effect. By turning swell and wind into dependable routes, they let people treat long water as a road between kitchens, councils, and workshops. The charts also provide a way to share credit. A good helmsman is known by the lack of drama in arrival. No frayed lashings, no anxious shouts at the pass, no hurried changes near the reef. The person who kept the belt through the day hands the steering blade to the next watch with a short, calm list. The reputation that grows from such work is a local currency. When someone needs to send an elderly relative to another atoll, or a load of goods for a celebration, they ask for the helmsman who keeps the long line, not the one who talks about speed. The charts, by asking for patience, give communities a way to value patience. Across the last century and more, outside forces have touched this world in steady waves. Under German rule in the late 19th and early 20th century, administrators and ethnographers collected stick charts and published drawings. Under Japanese administration between the World Wars and later under U.S. administration after 1945, economic life shifted. Copper runs and supply routes made new rhythms. Engines arrived, along with radios and later outboards. None of this erased the skill of reading swells. It reframed it. Sail and paddle could be chosen when fuel cost too much or when a reef pass asked for precise, quiet control. The charts stayed useful as teaching devices, even as fewer people depended on them every week. In recent decades, revival efforts have organized what families once handed on informally. In Majuro, the program known as Wan Aleng in Majel canoes. Of the Marshall Islands, often abbreviated VAM, has built and sailed canoes. trained young people in carving, lashing, and navigation, and folded seamanship into broader lessons about work and community. Visitors sometimes see the canoes first, with their crab claw sails and clean lines. Students see something else, a daily schedule that rewards showing up, listening, and keeping a steady task. Stick charts on the floor, boats on the water, and simple meals eaten under a sail combine into a small, complete school that teaches through repetition rather than display. Collaborations between navigators and scholars have added a careful layer of documentation without changing the crafts. Tone. Marshallese sailors such as Captain Corin Joel worked with researchers to record the feel of the dilip, the smoother belt, between atolls using instruments that logged pitch and roll. The resulting traces matched descriptions passed down by word and hand. University teams, including those affiliated with Hawaii, published analyses that made sense to engineers while returning copies of the work to canoe houses, where they were read as confirmations rather than corrections. The shared outcome was useful in a practical way. Teachers could explain both to elders, who already knew the belt, and to students who wanted to see its trace on paper. The chart's influence reaches ashore in quiet loops. A person who learns to stand at a helm and keep a long line learns to do similar work in other places, to finish a mat with even edges, to repair a roof flash without haste, to plan an errand, for the hour when the tide and wind are kind. Families that travel often adopt planning habits that line up with the sea's schedule. They prefer to leave after sunrise on days when the wind is clean and to return before the afternoon gusts. They sequence chores around the timing of passes. In this way, the stick chart becomes a planning map for a week as much as for a voyage. Communities also use the charts as a way to remember and to teach place names, which keep the island world close. Shell markers on a rebilib prompt recitations that tie physical roots to stories, family histories, and obligations. The chart can become a talking surface where a grandparent points at a shell and says, "Your cousin lives there. Your aunt's mats went along this line. When the wind turns in the next month, we will go by this other way." Geography remains practical, not abstract. It is a network of errands and relations made reachable by belts of sea that the charts help people hold in mind. Settlements outside the islands, especially in recent decades, add another layer. Marshallese communities living abroad keep contact with home by telephone, social media, and return trips. In places far from atolls, teaching about canoes and charts turns into lessons about memory and patience. Programs invite elders to speak about the feeling of the long swell and to lay out small stick charts so that children who grow up away from reefs can still carry the idea of how their relatives move between atolls. The objects themselves are light. The habits they teach attention over time. Confidence and steady cues travel easily. Because the charts favor the long view, they shape how risk is handled. Crews agree to postpone if the wind swings inconveniently, or if an outside swell slants across a route in a way that would turn the belt busy. They agree to stay within lagoon waters if the tide in the pass will be against them at their likely arrival time. They note where spare sennit is stored, check for wear at morning and evening, and practice small repairs before needing large ones. The method is repetitive, but it lowers the chance that a voyage will turn complicated. In settings where a single canoe might carry the week's fish, or a family's mats, or someone needing a doctor, avoiding complication is itself a quiet good. The material side of this is steady as well. Sennit lashings made from coconut fiber, twisted and braided, bind the sticks of a chart and the parts of a canoe. Maintenance joins navigation in daily life. A chart that lies flat begins to warp if left in damp air. It is rolled and stored properly. A canoe left on the beach too long dries and opens at seams. It is shaded, covered, and tended. Children. tasked with small duties, coiling cords, sorting shells, sweeping the chart. Space learn, a scaled-down version of watchkeeping. The care of objects teaches the same habits as the care of roots. Over time, people who work with charts and canoes build an archive of small observations that add up to community memory. In the season when the northern swell arrives, belt between these two atolls thickens near the middle. Last year, after the late storm, the pass through a cross-chop at half-tide, we will enter it slack. The lashing we used on that boom chafed on the port side. We will pad at this. Time. These are near to the ground. They are not treated as conclusions for all time. They are the current layer of knowledge, checked next season and updated with the finger's movement of a shell on the frame. Because this knowledge is light and cumulative, it recovers well from interruption. If a family's canoe is laid up for a year, the first returns are made on easy routes in good wind. The stick chart is brought out and refreshed with questions. Children who have not been to sea much are given short tasks. Stand at the bow and say when the longer rise comes back. Watch the birds at evening and say which way they go. Look at the watercolor and point out the shallow patch. The distance between chart and sea closes quickly in this way because the chart never tried to do more than give the right expectations. The language around charts and routes also helps keep a respectful pace. Descriptions favor simple recurring phrases. The belt returns after a few minutes. The pass runs stronger on the ebb. The wind will ease later in the afternoon. People learn to speak about the sea in calm terms. In turn, the sea is less likely to be treated as demanding a performance. A canoe is kept off the edge of a reef, not because someone shouted, but because a habit of words made the crew expect that being a few finger widths to leeward would feel better and be safer. Some visitors ask whether the charts can survive in a world of engines and screens. The answer lies in the way they teach. The charts are not against new tools. They train attention that pairs well with any tool. A helmsman who has learned to keep the long line by feel will steer an engine boat more gently, using less fuel and putting less stress on wood and fastenings. A crew that uses a GPS to confirm distance will still benefit from knowing when to leave a pass and which belt will make the ride easy. Programs that teach with charts often include modern safety gear, radios, and training in weather awareness. The result is not a contest between old and new, but an arrangement. Keep the human skills in daily use and let devices serve when they are appropriate. In this arrangement, the stick chart remains a modest authority. It is laid out in a canoe house in view of everyone. It is adjusted by elders who invite younger hands to move a stick and see if the adjustment makes sense. It is carried on a canoe for ceremony or teaching, then set back down on land so it can do its main job. Organize the mind before departure and after return. That public domestic presence keeps the knowledge woven into daily life rather than set aside as a museum object. Museums have a place too. They preserve examples and spark interest. But the chart's calm power is most at home on a swept floor. Among people who will use it next week. As this story settles, you can picture the close of an ordinary passage. The canoe coasts inside the lagoon. Children wave. A faint smoke line on shore suggests a cooking fire. The helmsman eases the sheet and lets the bow fall off a little so the boat lands softly on a strip of sand. The crew steps out, lifts the chow, hull a safe distance above the wash, and turns to small chores. A few words mark what the sea did that day, how the belt leaned or the chop gathered at the pass. Someone moves a shell on the chart, half a finger width, and nods. The line between atolls is now a little clearer. The next trip will be smoother for it. The larger legacy is the style of mind that grows from these small adjustments. Patient, willing to let repeated signs earn trust. confident in routines that make long water familiar. In that style, the ocean is not an obstacle. It is a set of habits to be matched. Stick charts made those habits teachable, then left the work to hands and feet. The result has been uneventful arrivals, which are a kind of quiet success that makes life in an atoll world possible.